not being eaten alive, and I'm not being stung to death. But there are 1.5 kilos of honeybees in my hands, and that's between 10,000 and 12,000 bees. And not one of those bees has stung me. I keep bees in my garden at home, and this is a film about those bees and their strange and mysterious behaviour.
At first glance, it may seem that this Australian beekeeper has a fatal attraction for his bees, all 12,000 of them. In fact, the centre of interest is the queen bee held hostage in this container. Untroubled by Phil Simon, the bees sense the queen and swarm around. She is the focal point of the colony. Without a queen, the bees will die. To be as close as this to bees is not recommended to any but the most experienced apiarist. A bee sting can be fatal. Phil Simon has to know his bees well and choose such moments as these with the greatest care.
Now I'm going to try and encourage these bees to stay in the hive by placing the queen bee in there. Still not stinging, there's no aggression at all. They just want to find a new colony somewhere. So if I put the queen in there, they'll be quite content to stay in the hive. These ones out here on the grass will follow in.
With so many bees milling around, just who do you follow? Well, those nearest the hive stand still and expose a scent gland on top of the abdomen. As each bee fans her wings, a stream of air passes over the gland, carrying her scent to all the other bees in the swarm. It's this scent trail that the bees follow into the hive. Because of man's success with hive bees, it's often wrongly assumed that the bee has been conveniently domesticated. In fact, hive bees are independent and may up and away to a more airy home without so much as by your leave. These natural combs are marvels of bee engineering. They look extremely fragile, but in fact this wafer-thin construction is very strong and has to be to support the stored honey as well as thousands of bees. English settlers first brought the honeybee to Australia 150 years ago. They were quite unlike the native Australian bees. The bush or sweat bee, which is waspish in appearance, is in fact stingless. Like the European bee, it is social and it does hoard pollen and nectar, but the quantity and quality of its honey is poor. The Aborigines found it worth collecting, but European settlers didn't. Australia also has solitary bees, which live in small nests and have no need to stockpile large supplies of honey. Another species spends its day alone, but congregates to roost. Landing space is limited, and the bees compete for a place to spend the night. With powerful jaws clamped to the vine, each bee frantically waves her legs to move on late arrivals. Faced only with such competition, the imported honeybee thrived, and it now outnumbers the native bees. Although this swarm may seem aggressive, these new Australians are remarkably good-natured, even when their temporary resting place begins to give way. A disturbing shake-up, but there's no sign of anger. It seems that a well-fed bee is a happy bee, but it's wise to be wary when the swarms are house hunting. The longer it takes them, the more energy they use and the more likely they are to sting. In their search for a new home, it's the scouts from the swarm that investigate suitable nest sites. Their choice is not always convenient to local residents, but swarming bees do provide well-protected beekeepers with the opportunity to set up a new hive colony. Left alone, the swarm would eventually build its nest in the wild. But treated correctly, they can be persuaded to do so in man's version of a nest, which is more convenient for his purposes, the hive. Its layout is very precise. The space between each wooden frame is exactly the same as the bees allow between their wild honeycombs. To encourage the bees to build their honeycombs to exactly fill each frame, Phil Simon wires in a thin sheet of beeswax. It's the base on which the bees will build the network of hexagonal cells that form the heart of the hive.
Now these frames allow the beekeeper to inspect his honeycombs one by one, inspecting them for the quantity of honey and pollen, and also the number of eggs that the queen is laying. Now there are a few eggs on that side, but I can't see the queen, so she's probably on the next frame.
It's important to the beekeeper that the queen is hard-working and good-natured, because the chances are that her subjects will reflect her behavior. To understand better the relationship between queen and subject, we need to look more closely inside the hive. The queen is in the center of the picture. Only slightly bigger than her subjects, she's mother of them all. She's a prodigious egg factory, laying her own body weight in eggs every day. So specialized is she that she's unable to collect food for herself and has to be fed and groomed by her ladies-in-waiting. She lays a single egg in each cell. Unfertilized eggs become male or drone bees. Eggs fertilized by sperm stored in her body become the female bees, the workers of the colony. Within 3 weeks, the worker bees hatch out. Most of the bees in the hive are workers. There may be 50,000 of them at the height of summer. With only 4 to 6 weeks to live, the young worker begins life as she'll end it, in a routine of chores. Unable to sting or fly at this stage, her first days are spent as a domestic, cleaning the nursery and preparing the cells for the next generation of bees. Within 3 or 4 days, the worker bee develops a special gland on her head. Now she can move on to her next task, that of nurse bee. The gland secretes a substance from which she produces bee milk. This she feeds to the grubs recently hatched from the queen's eggs. As the grubs develop, the nurse bees add pollen to their bee milk. It's rich in vitamins, minerals, and proteins, and the grubs increase weight over 1,300 times in just 6 days. It will be 12 more days before the young workers finally emerge from the cells, sealed by the nurses. For warmth and protection, the brood area is in the center of the hive, surrounded by the stores of pollen and nectar. The gathering of these vital food supplies is the responsibility of the mature workers or field bees. They are selective feeders and will fly 2 or 3 miles from the hive to collect nectar or pollen from a favorite flower. Once home, the field bee regurgitates nectar and passes it to the house bee. This mouth-to-mouth contact and gentle caressing of feelers is an essential part of bee communication. Any pollen she's collected is removed from pollen baskets on her hind legs and put into store. This task complete, she leaves the hive to repeat the process. The nectar is concentrated and digested by worker bees to produce honey to feed the colony. It's stored in capped cells, and it's this surplus food supply that the beekeepers harvest. One full honeycomb frame contains 3 kilograms. That's 6.5 pounds of pure honey. To build such efficient storage facilities, the worker bees first gorge themselves with honey. Then, suspended like building workers on a construction site, they start to produce the delicate scales of wax, the building material of the honeycomb. Scales of beeswax come from glands on the abdomens of the worker bees. The bees scrape these scales off their bodies and mold them in their jaws to form the hexagonal cells of the honeycomb. The work is hectic, but eventually out of the chaos comes the beauty and precision of a new honeycomb, so strong that it can support 30 times its weight in honey. Bees are also competent ventilation engineers. If the hive becomes too hot, the honeycomb will melt and disintegrate. So worker bees are drafted in to help cool the hive. Standing at the entrance, the bees fan their wings. This drives stale, humid air out of the hive. On this side, just in the entrance, other bees fan fresh air into the hive. Circulating air throughout the colony helps honeybees maintain a hive temperature of about 34 degrees centigrade, summer or winter. The only drawback of this way of life is that the nests are large and relatively easy to find, so more vulnerable to predators. To protect the colony with its precious pollen and honey, guard bees are therefore posted at the hive entrance. It will be the last household duty our worker performs. An intruder is dealt with swiftly and sharply. Honeybees can withdraw their stings from other insects to sting again and again. This beetle will be lucky to escape with its life. The bee sting is an effective weapon, but when used against man, it has disastrous consequences for the bee.
Well, normally I just flick this sting straight out, but I'll show you what an amazing weapon this sting really is.
Embedded in Phil Simon's finger, the sting lives on, but the bee will soon die from her injuries. Barbs in the sting catch under our skin. Muscles in the bulb at the top of the sting pump venom out of the poison sac and into the wound, like a hypodermic syringe. What is more, the muscles draw the sting deeper and deeper into the wound, like this. A bee sting is painful and can even be fatal, so it's worth knowing how to remove one.
The main thing is to get it out quickly. Just use a sharp edge or your fingernail and just scrape it out like that. There, didn't hurt a bit.
When 3 weeks old, the young worker bees take to the air to familiarize themselves with home ground. Then for our worker bee, it's a quick buzz down to the local flower patch to stock up with fresh supplies. honeybee is splendidly equipped for gathering pollen. Legs, jaws and body hairs all help in collecting the tiny grains. To make it easier, she moistens the dry pollen with a little honey from her mouth. She has a built-in solution to the transport problem. Watch carefully as her middle legs brush the sticky pollen off her body. She now manipulates the pollen into hair-lined baskets on her back legs. Collecting a full load may take half an hour. For the last 3 weeks of her short life, our worker, now a fully fledged field bee, will gather supplies 4 or 5 times a day, depending on the needs of the colony and the availability of flowering plants. Here, a pumpkin flower satisfies a demand for nectar. The Australian honeybee is more industrious than its English cousins and produces the largest quantity of honey per hive in the world. Australia's warm climate and great variety of native flowering trees offer beekeepers like Phil Simon almost year-round honey production. The flowering bonanza attracts a field bee on the lookout for nectar, but so too are a few others. Once found, a supply of nectar is sucked up with the tongue into a special honey sac. The sac is no bigger than a pinhead. To fill it up once, a bee may have to visit over 500 flowers. Loaded up, she heads home to pass on the news of the find to her sister workers. The dance she performs is the language of the bees. Amongst animals, it's unique, for it communicates the distance and direction of a food source. Her increasingly elaborate routine of movements is somehow read by her sisters. Remember, they're in the dark inside the hive. So to help her sisters find the right flowers, she passes round samples of the new nectar. Translated, her dance may be saying, if you set a course at 90 degrees to the sun and fly away from the hive for 900 meters, you'll find the flowers I've just visited. Fully laden, a worker bee is not the best of flyers. Many of the foragers return home safely. Others are not so lucky. An Australian orb-web spider takes her toll. A drop in temperature may ground a returning bee. On her own, she's vulnerable. During the summer, hundreds of bees die each day. It's a natural loss and doesn't affect the growth of the bee colony. Replacements are already on the wing. The colony is now well established, and inside the hive, odd dome-shaped cells begin to appear on the outer combs. Soon, odd faces peer out. The drones have arrived. Drones are the males of the colony and develop from unfertilized eggs. They're much larger than their sisters, but they can't sting. With large eyes and powerful wings, the only known service the drones perform is to fly off and mate with virgin queens. For the bees, it's been a productive year. The colony has fed well. 50,000 bees crowd the honeycombs. But in these cramped conditions, things are beginning to get out of hand. The queen is unable to move freely. Many of her subjects are not receiving the chemical signals that declare her presence and reassure the workers. Tense and irritable at this lack of contact with the queen, the message is clear: the colony is doomed. To survive, they must acquire a successor to the throne. Remarkably, a solution lies beneath their feet, inside the very same cells where they hatched into minute grubs. The selected cells are enlarged into special queen cells, and the grubs are fed a glandular secretion called royal jelly. The heir apparents develop rapidly. Within 9 days, they completely fill their cells and are sealed in by the nurse bees. For another week, the workers await the outcome in an air of intense expectancy. Then, on the 7th day, a new queen emerges to make her bid for the throne. But there's a second queen. Only one of them can reign supreme. Guided by a shrill piping, the first queen sets out to destroy the pretender to the crown. The workers respond to the royal decree. Her throne is secure. Now the victorious queen will mate on the wing. With a band of new followers, she'll start a colony of her own. Australia's bees produce 20,000 tons of honey every year. Perhaps it's worth remembering that to fill just one jar, our mysterious bees have had to travel a distance equal to a flight 3 times round the world.